NASA animation of what is supposed to happen on a normal launch. And then the external tank will separate and it will break up. That external tank is filled with a combination of oxygen and hydrogen. It fuels the main engines, which are at the very bottom of the spacecraft itself. They're used for liftoff and then for directional purposes during the course of the flight. And then, of course, they're used once again as they re-enter the Earth's atmosphere for the landing either at Cape Canaveral or sometimes at California at Edwards Air Force Base. At the Jet Propulsion Laboratory today in Pasadena, California, NBC News space correspondent Roy Neal, who has watched a lot of these, and he has watched a lot of, or too many tragedies over the years as well. Roy?
Let me first of all say that NASA had planned on everything except what happened this morning. As you know, they had abort modes, 4 of them, which would handle almost every situation, including an escape chute down which they could ride off the launch pad. But this, whatever it was, this catastrophic failure was not in the NASA plan. And what it means to most of the experienced reporters here who have been covering this beat and who are here in Pasadena because we've been observing Voyager passing by Uranus. What it means to most of the reporters here is NASA now has to go back to its drawing board. First, it has to find out what happened, and after that, in addition to finding out what happened, what do they do to fix it? The only time before in the whole history of the space program that astronauts have ever been killed in the line of duty was back on what they call Apollo 1. And at that time, the spacecraft was on the launch pad. It was an early version of the Apollo spacecraft, which called for a total redesign. Now, obviously, the space shuttle, having flown a number of times and flown very well, experienced something strange, something that caused catastrophe. Among the reporters here, there was a mood. It was incredible. They were gathered for a news conference that should be taking place in about a half hour, a climatic news conference that should have covered all the wonderful things that an unmanned probe had discovered in deep space out of a far planet. Instead, as they watched in utter amazement on their monitors, the reporters saw instead catastrophe at the Cape. An explosion the size of a small nuclear weapon, we are told, because that's about the explosive capability of the external fuel tank when it blows. A small nuclear weapon, in space, of course, actually in atmosphere, but high enough that no one was there to observe it. Enough miles from the Cape that they could see it, but not feel the power of that detonation. There was one chute that was seen, but the observers also know there were no chutes for the crew. No chutes, no escape tower, no way out for this kind of failure. Instead, the only chutes on board were to bring down the solid rocket boosters. And one of them did indeed deploy, and presumably there's a solid rocket booster somewhat burned out somewhere out there in the Atlantic Ocean. But as far as the crew is concerned at this writing, it would seem totally hopeless, and NASA obviously has suffered a tremendous tragedy with a catastrophic failure today. Tom?
Right, wouldn't you think that the shuttle program now is just going to be on hold for an undetermined number of months? They've had a number of difficulties with the launch of this vehicle before today because of not just weather, but they had problems even with the door handle yesterday. Don't you think that they're...
Incredible setback to the shuttle program, at least. It's just going to make, I think, people that much more conscious of safety as they were after the Apollo blow-up in '67.
When you look at husband Steve there in that tape recording, then you stop to realize that he and the 2 children, McAuliffe children, were watching live the launch this morning. And of course, less than 2 minutes after the launch, the massive explosion in space.
It is now just a little after 12:30 in the eastern United States, and not by any means to repeat it for the sake of repeating it, but because that's a program change in many of the places around the country. We're going to run again the liftoff of the Challenger as it took off from Cape Canaveral this morning. John Quinones described it to us from the Cape just a few moments ago as perfectly normal in every respect. You'll recall it had been delayed yesterday because of high weather, and it had been delayed the day before because they couldn't get a screw fully tightened down on one of the hatches. But for those of you around the country who may just be joining us now for the first time and may not have heard the news or perhaps not have seen it, here again is the liftoff of the shuttle from the Cape this morning. That is not the liftoff. That is the subsequent tragic result as something blows up about 7 to 10 miles above the Atlantic Ocean across the Cape. I must tell you, Steve, having now seen that 4 or 5 times, that great ball of fire looks to me like it may be one of the solid rocket boosters.
the enormous power, 2.5 million pounds of thrust, that is all a part of that launch that we have come to take so for granted. And that, of course, was the mix that we just saw exploding once again in that replay of what took place at shortly after 11:39 launch time, Eastern time this morning. The Space Shuttle Challenger with its crew of 7. We do not have any official word yet on the fate of the 7 crew members. 2 women actually aboard, Krista McAuliffe, the school teacher from New Hampshire, but also Judy Resnick, who was one of the mission specialists who had already logged 144 hours in space.
Okay. I'm told we can now look at the entire launch sequence, that is to say when the astronauts and the mission specialists went back on board early this morning, and there they are, liftoff from the Cape.
Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now control program. Roger, Challenger.
Nonchalant.
Roll program confirmed.
Control.
Challenger now heading down range. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Accelerating towards 2,000 miles an hour.
This 1,977 miles per hour, 10.4 miles up, 8 miles out at the time of the explosion.
And you are seeing that in slow motion, by the way, now.
Distance 7 nautical miles.
This the first in-flight disaster for the U.S. space program in 56 manned missions, going back to the original Shepard flight.
Steve, would you tell someone in our control room they have the key open that we're hearing everything that's going on in the building?
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
Once again, for those of you who have just joined us, there has been a disaster on the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger with its 7-man crew. The shuttle exploding 1 minute, 15 seconds after launch from Cape Canaveral this morning. There had been a delay, one caused by a faulty gauge. There had also been a delay that was caused by ice forming on the pad because the temperature was 24 degrees this morning at Cape Canaveral. No indication that that had anything to do with the enormous explosion that took place as the shuttle was just reaching that maximum period of thrust in what had appeared to be an extremely normal launch. There was the normal excitement in the voice of mission control, and then the almost detached voice reading off the various numbers on what appeared to be a picture-perfect launch, but then was interrupted by this devastating explosion.
Steve, it is only now 33 minutes after noon in the east that all of the rescue teams are being allowed into what we will call the search area for the moment, because there was so much debris raining down from 10 miles up above that NASA feared for the safety of those people going to look for survivors, principally, is what they've got to look for. So only now, about 35 minutes after noon in the east, are people getting into the area to begin to search those waters of the Atlantic, which we have seen so desolate this morning.
And we might remind our viewers that while the earliest shuttles did have an escape capsule, the present ones have no particular escape mechanisms whatsoever. The capsule is its own entity.
It is that point in a mission where while the concern is immensely high at all times and you're beginning to push out towards orbit there, you're not as concerned. You'll recall in many of the space programs, the great concern has been for people on the launching pad. Yes. Back in 1967, when Gus Grissom, among others, was killed when it when the Apollo blew up on the launching pad. It became enormous concern for how do you get people out at that particular time. When the shuttle is driving for orbit and everything looks A-OK, you stop thinking about it to some extent.
The explosion occurred this morning, we're told, at about the time that the Challenger was to enter its period of maximum aerodynamic pressure, 526,000 gallons of liquid hydrogen and oxygen, all aboard, and the massive explosion.
The first flight disaster in 56 missions, and as Steve has been saying so accurately, this is the 25th of the shuttle missions. And this highly accelerated program, you'll recall just the other day, they had to move, was it Columbia or Challenger? I get them mixed up sometimes, from California back quickly in order to get it ready, because the mission program is really going.
Saw before the great fireball was in place and doing its job. The solid rocket boosters carrying the shuttle toward its orbit, but only a minute and 12 seconds in, and it was, as Bruce Hall told us earlier, one of the 2 or 3 most dangerous periods of any launch. Now, with that information, as best I can pass it along to you, let's take a look at the videotape as to what happened after launch this morning.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Roger, roll, Challenger. Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up. Challenger, go at throttle up.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
Videotape of what remained of the space shuttle after that tremendous fireball explosion.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction. We have no downlink.
What remains of Space Shuttle Challenger plunging toward the sea off Cape Canaveral. Now, while it is impossible to say exactly what caused the explosion this morning, no one can say what caused the explosion. And the National Aeronautics and Space Administration seems to be puzzled at this moment as to what could have caused it.
We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that
this is the slow motion, a slow motion replay of the accident. Watch this now. This is slow motion replay of the accident, indicates what happened. You can see a small explosion apparently on the right side of one of the solid rocket boosters. Then a few seconds later, the main huge explosion and the fireball that appears to consume the Challenger. Awful as it is, let us take this videotape, if you will, and control back to the beginning, because with what little we know about this story, it may be important that people understand what you can see and what you can't see. And we're going to show you in slow motion why it's now, as we take a close look at it, you can tell what happened. Now, this is normal motion. Now, close up, you see. Now, that's normal motion. Now let's take slow motion coming back and watch the right side of one of those solid rocket boosters. And you'll see that the explosion apparently started on the right side of one of the solid rocket boosters, and then a few seconds later, the main huge explosion and fireball that just obliterated the Challenger. Let's take it in slow motion here, if we may. Now re-rack that to show the slow motion. While they're doing that, when we say the solid rocket boosters, we're talking about these are the solid rocket boosters. And now when we see it in slow motion, we can clearly see the explosion happen on the right side, first on the right side of one of those solid rocket boosters, and then there was the major explosion. Now let's take a look at the slow motion replay. See the Challenger riding as it's supposed to. Then that small explosion on the right side of one of the solid rocket boosters, followed by the greater and main explosion. All of this happening a minute and 12 seconds into this morning's launch. The 56 times NASA has put a man, at least one human, into space. Now, on the upper right-hand side, pardon me for interrupting, but you can now see this is terrifying and fascinating as you see the slow motion. Look at your picture, upper right-hand quadrant of the picture. You can see the long pencil-like extension away from the explosion, upper right-hand corner of your screen. That is one of the solid rocket boosters blown apart from the space shuttle, as the space shuttle, its main fuel tank, and the shuttle itself and the other solid rocket booster are completely obliterated. And you can see, emphasize again, that in the slow motion that the first explosion occurred on the right-hand side of one of those solid rocket boosters. And as Bruce Hall said earlier, there was a hard freeze in Florida this morning, and one of the theories, underscore, italicize, all caps, one of the theories is that perhaps some icicles formed by the hard freeze coming off the Space Shuttle Challenger may have caused the explosion in one of these solid rocket boosters. Now, Bill Plant, our White House correspondent, is at the White House where Larry Speaks, President Reagan's principal spokesman, briefed earlier, and then very sadly, a bit earlier on in the morning. Bill, do we know anything more at the White House? Do they know anything more now about what may have happened?
Dan, there's been nothing new that's come in here. They're still watching. They're still waiting, listening to NASA. There is, I understand, a direct link now between the White House and NASA. But as far as we know, they've been able to tell them nothing new. The president reacted with stunned silence, we're told, when he was informed about this by the vice president and the national security advisor. He was in the Oval Office when he heard the news. He stepped into the small room next to the Oval Office where there's a television set, and we're told then turned it on and looked at the video replays, which we have just seen. It's a very tough moment for this White House. Perhaps the more so because of the message of hope and optimism that Mr. Reagan is planning to sound tonight at the State of the Union address. We are told, Dan, though, that the president will certainly mention something about this tonight in his State of the Union.
Bill, was consideration given to not having the State of the Union tonight, to postponing it?
Not as far as we know, Dan. That's one of the first questions that was asked of Larry Speaks, the president's spokesman, and he indicated that they hadn't talked about that yet or thought about it. We did see the Chief of Staff, Donald Regan, at the time that this was all learned. There were a group of reporters in for a briefing about the State of the Union. We saw the National Security Advisor, Admiral Poindexter, get up and talk to an aide and walk out. And then a moment later, someone brought in a note to Regan, the Chief of Staff. He looked down, he read it, and said, "I'm very sorry to have to tell you that the space shuttle has blown up." And that's about when the president learned. So they really have had very little chance to do anything but be shocked, as we all were.
Well, Bill, the State of the Union message is scheduled for 9 o'clock this evening Eastern Time, 8 o'clock Central Time. There still is a chance, there still is time for them to change their mind about going ahead with it, but your emphasis for the moment is that you've been told that the president does intend to go ahead with the State of the Union tonight as scheduled.
That's right, Dan, as far as we know now.
Thank you, Bill. Schoolteacher Chris McAuliffe's parents, Ed and Grace Corrigan, as we mentioned earlier, were at the Cape this morning at a VIP site about 3 miles from the actual launch. They were watching the launch. Here's what happened. Of schoolteacher McAuliffe as they watched the Space Shuttle launch this morning, a launch that began for them with great pride and joy and ended in tears. Before that awful moment, everything seemed fine as the astronauts ate breakfast before the launch.
Cornell crew enjoying breakfast, Mission Specialist.
Dan, this was the astronauts as they were having breakfast earlier this morning. It was a very happy group. They were very pleased to be going on this shuttle. Ellison Onizuka, and you saw Krista McAuliffe. And as they had breakfast, there was the traditional cake wishing them good luck. For identification purposes, you have Judy Resnick and Ron McNair there, and Greg Jarvis. They were all ready to go and anxious to go after several delays, and as they left the breakfast area and left the building where they had been spending the time, Krista McAuliffe said, "It's going to go today." Krista McAuliffe was looking forward to this flight. She was extremely anxious. She felt after several months of training now she had become part of the team. She still considered herself a teacher rather than an astronaut, but she felt that she had become part of the team. NASA now has some cameras that have reached the scene of the incident, and I don't know if you're able to see this in New York, Dan, but I can tell here we see several pieces of debris that are out into the ocean, which appear from every indication we have here to be, maybe 3, 4, or 5 miles off the coast of Florida here at the Kennedy Space Center. It appears in looking at the screen that there are small pieces of debris scattered over a wide area. This is a NASA plane that is flying over the impact area. According to the first reports from people on the scene, that it was just small pieces showered down for several seconds, and almost it seemed like several minutes. However, it is more likely that it was a few seconds. You can see in the center of your screen, as they zoom in, small pieces from the Space Shuttle Challenger. And these are the first scenes from the recovery operation. NASA has sent several paramedics into the area. The paramedics are now in the water, and they are looking for any evidence that they can find or the possibility of any survivors. These are the first pictures that we've been able to see from the recovery scene just a few miles off the Kennedy Space Center. It appears from looking at this that these are relatively small pieces. This is a very large, the shuttle is very large, along with the solid rocket boosters. And what we are able to see in the ocean itself appear to be quite small pieces, relatively speaking. Somewhat similar to what you have seen as the results of a number of plane crashes, when there has been an explosion and there's just very little left.
We do want to point out that these are live pictures from the recovery area, which is a short distance east of the United States mainland off Florida. Since the explosion aboard Space Shuttle Challenger happened this morning, only 1 minute and 12 seconds into flight, and given the size, the huge fireball, one is not surprised to see so little debris in the water there. Bruce, it may be worth that we've had some questions. Clearly anything as complicated as one of these space shuttle launches about what could have happened there. Perhaps what we should do is again talk about at what stage the Space Shuttle Challenger this morning was in during the launch and the liftoff, and what appears to have happened. Now, what we will try to do is, do you have a model there, Bruce, or not?
Dan, I do not have a model here in front of me. I think I'll have one here in a couple of minutes. The
help me as we go.
Have been using has been very good in the way that you have been explaining it. And connected with that, the stop-action videotape that you have been looking at, you can actually see the point of where the explosion occurred. Now, there are several possibilities here, and you must realize that NASA has made no announcement at all. But for those people who have viewed a number of these flights, there are several things come to mind immediately. At the point in the flight when the explosion took place, there was 250,000 gallons a second of superfluids, liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, flowing to the engines. And it was during that point, approximately 1 minute 12 into the flight, that it appeared from the stop-action videotape that a small explosion occurred, a very small one, and then a major explosion in the main tank. This is the tank where all of the fuel is stored. This is a tank that is not reusable. It normally drops off over the Indian Ocean. But this was completely full at the time. And when that main explosion, that is the fireball that you saw. It is that main tank exploding. It appeared to us here, those of us who were looking at the videotape that you were showing, there was a very small, just a second or maybe even a millisecond prior to the main explosion, a smaller ignition or a little explosion in the solid rocket booster, as you indicated earlier. But it is a time when they're at full thrust, 104% thrust they call it here. It is the time during the shuttle mission when there is the most power during the entire flight. And after they get into orbit and the solid rocket boosters fall away at just after 2 minutes into the flight, then they throttle back to 60% of thrust. But at the time the explosion occurred, it was the time when the thrust was at the strongest point of any time during a shuttle trip.
Just to underscore that, Bruce, and we've been trying to explain as best we can as we go along what appears to have happened this morning.
Pictures were taped earlier. That was at the time of the liftoff.
Lloyd, this isn't...
Pamela Wallen is standing by in Ottawa. Dave, she may be able to bring some perspective to us from the Ottawa scene and the reaction there to this disaster. Good morning, Pamela.
Good morning, Lloyd. We did, of course, just a few moments ago hear from the Prime Minister, who emerged from a high-powered cabinet meeting. He had been locked up with some of his cabinet colleagues while this whole event, tragic event, unfolded. He did come forward and make a statement. He described this morning's event as a monumental tragedy. He had called the American ambassador to express his concern for the families and friends of those of the 7 who are aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger. He also took the opportunity this morning to comment on the fact that Canada, the federal cabinet, the government is now considering Canada's participation in a U.S. space station proposal at a cost of course, multi-millions of dollars. And the Prime Minister insisted, while no final decision has been made, that this incident this morning should not discourage people, should not discourage Canada from participating in what will be a very important and ongoing and continuing space program. So he did reassure everyone on that score. We have also been in touch with the National Research Council. Dr. Carl Deutsch, who is head of the Canadian Astronaut Program, is of course there at headquarters. They are in a meeting discussing the implications of all this, and I'm sure watching it along with all other Canadians at this point. One of the backup astronauts of the Canadian program is there as well, Bob Thirsk. He was the Canadian backup for Marc Garneau, of course, Canada's first astronaut, who went off into space on October 4th, 1984. Marc Garneau, as you may know, is in Houston today watching the whole launch of the Challenger, so he is not in Ottawa. Steve McLean, who has been selected as Canada's second Canadian for the shuttle program, is in Quebec today. Everybody is trying to, of course, contact him. He will be the next man up, a young 31-year-old laser physicist who has been involved in the program since 1983, studied at MIT, and he, of course, described his chances to become Canada's second astronaut as a fulfillment of a dream. And we have heard so much from Marc Garneau in the past couple of years about how important that was. So I think even given the very serious and tragic proportions of the event earlier today, with the Challenger, Canada will proceed at this point with negotiations with Washington to participate, continue to participate fully and directly in the space program, including the participation of Canadian astronauts.
Well, Pamela, as you recall, there was one previous accident,
Right.
mentioned it earlier, in 1967, and there was an...
They have a firing time of 2 minutes and 10 seconds, but it does not appear that they were the principal cause of the explosion. NASA being very deliberate and very careful in conveying any information. What we do know is that rescue paramedic teams have been sent to the area in the Atlantic where debris has been coming down. One of the problems, however, so much debris.
In terms of looking ahead at where NASA goes from here, it was probably also a good idea to look back a little bit, because this was the 25th lift. This was the 10th time for the workhorse of the fleet, the Challenger. And they had accomplished a great number of things. They had laid to rest, by putting civilians up in the air, they had laid to rest some of the mystique that was built up around the early NASA astronauts. You no longer had to be a test pilot. You no longer had to be a specialist in one sort or another. You could be, and today was, for the first time, included in the crew, an ordinary citizen. And we're looking at pictures now that indicate how difficult it is going to be to find and recover and make sense of what happened this morning. The pieces, they say, have still been raining down from the sky. They came from a long way up. The smaller ones, the ones that are made basically out of scrap sheet metal. The heavier pieces, they gave us an impact time and point a long while back. Not very, in fact, the heavier pieces, Tom, seemed to come down almost as fast as they went up, which was quite fast indeed. NASA does have a helicopter, which is part of the coverage.
Rocket boosters intact. We're about 3/4 a minute into it. Now, stop right there. You can see the first explosion appears to happen at the right side of one of those solid rocket fuel boosters. And then the liquid fuel, liquid oxygen and highly explosive liquid hydrogen fuel on which the space shuttle is riding also goes up and creates the fireball. That a slow motion replay of the videotape, and if we can go again now live to the recovery area, if we still have that capacity, the search for debris and survivors, this is the scene. This is a live shot from on board a NASA aircraft in the area. Very little debris spotted. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration still has no explanation.
Those search teams are now going over an area 18 miles from Cape Canaveral in the Atlantic Ocean. They have not reported back on anything that they may have found as yet. It is indeed a sad tragedy here. When Krista McAuliffe went into the White Room for final preparations this morning before she entered the shuttle, she was handed an apple by a member of the Prozat crew, and the whole crew wishing her good luck. The school teachers' parents were present here watching the liftoff in person. And they saw first a successful launch, as usual, a majestic launch. There were no indications that anything was wrong at that point, but then second...
Operation. David?
Dan, the recovery operation is being run by the Coast Guard, which had two cutters in the area at the time. There were no U.S. Navy ships in the immediate area. You have the two Coast Guard cutters, a third cutter that is close to the area, all three of them converging on the site of where this debris has rained down. There is a report, and we cannot confirm it from here yet, that the actual recovery operation was delayed somewhat to stay out of the area while all this debris rained down. There are two Navy ships en route to the area. One's about 45 minutes away. The other is about
a minute into the flight.
We're watching here a replay
now, as we watch it
of
go
the
up,
launch
you
of
will
the
see
Space Shuttle
the
Challenger
separation of some of the booster rockets, and then that enormous explosion, and then the corkscrew-like effect as the spaceship, the shuttle, begins to fall to the ground. Now that external booster tank, the huge tank in the center there, could be the one that caused the problem, although that is only speculation at this stage.
It certainly is a very crucial time, though, Lloyd, in the launch of any space shuttle at this particular flight. Separation lost crucial meters in terms of getting it safely into orbit. This is also, we should point out, the point at which
throttling up, 3 engines down, 104%.
Challenger, go and throttle up.
And there's fuel tanks, etc., from the upper atmosphere, 5 engines, and that sort of thing.
And there we see the explosion just after NASA told the astronauts aboard the Shuttle Challenger to go at full throttle up. And there you see the strange configurations of the smoke and the burning shuttle. This is the 10th flight for the Shuttle Challenger. And again, the first time there has been an accident of this type after the launch from the Cape. Let's go now to the
center after a delay of about 2 hours this morning, and that's the result. And at this stage, rescue ships are in the area. We're going to take a look at this in slow motion now. You'll be seeing pictures like this throughout the day, and this is just what happened in slow motion. We can't see exactly what happened, of course, because our view of the external fuel tank is somewhat shielded there. But
Lloyd, there was a report earlier that experts at NASA saw the orange ball. There was a small flame that erupted just moments before, just seconds before the actual explosion itself. But as you can see, when those two highly flammable ingredients in that huge tank that forms the basis of the launch itself met the result, an ominous explosion in space.
We hadn't heard anything about problems with the external fuel tank, had we? There was no mention of anything happening there. There were a few. What were the... you were following it this morning, I gather, and there were a few technical...
Morehead City, North Carolina. Judy Resnick, astronaut, 36 years old, Ph.D., born in Akron, Ohio. All of these members of the crew. Ronald McNair, another Ph.D., 35 years old, born in Lake City, South Carolina. Ellison Onizuka, Major, U.S. Air Force, 39 years old, born in Hawaii. And 41-year-old Gregory Jorvis, born in Detroit, crew member. And then the special passenger aboard this Space Shuttle Challenger, Krista McAuliffe, 37 years old, school teacher, mother out of Concord, New Hampshire. Those were the Americans aboard this morning's Space Shuttle Challenger launch. As you may have heard us report earlier, the school children from the school of school teacher Krista McAuliffe were called together at the school this morning to watch the launch. They watched and applauded as the launch got off, noting that Bruce Hall said later that close observers of the launch thought that the Space Shuttle Challenger was getting up a little slower this morning than was usual for such launches. But of course, those school children had no way of knowing that, and they applauded as the Space Shuttle Challenger seemed to get off all right, and then they watched in horror during the live shot of the takeoff as that big fireball appeared, and it was clear that something went wrong. Correspondent Eric Ingberg reports now that an inquiry panel is to be established to investigate the cause of today's accident as per standard NASA procedures. The makeup of the panel, when it will start its work, still being evaluated. Of course, as the National Aeronautics and Space Administration tries to figure out not only what happened this morning, you can see in the videotape, both the real-time videotape and the slow-motion videotape, some of what happened, but of course what NASA wants to know is why it happened. This is the first time there's been such a disaster during a space flight. In 1967, 3 astronauts in the Apollo program, the program that eventually put the United States on the moon. During that program, 3 astronauts died in an accident on the launch pad. This is the first disaster in space for the United States. 7 persons aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger this morning. Their fates cannot be absolutely determined at this hour. Again, we are told that President Reagan watched in, quote, stunned silence as the shuttle exploded this morning. We're told that the president was watching the liftoff live from Florida. President Reagan's spokesman, Larry Speaks, is saying that the president will go ahead with his State of the Union address tonight. Said Speaks, and I quote him, "I'm certain the president will feel compelled to mention this tragedy depending on the outcome." That's unquote Larry Speaks. Now, President Reagan's State of the Union address will be carried live this evening on CBS. That will be at 9 o'clock tonight Eastern Time, 8 o'clock, of course, Central Time, and 6 o'clock in the West. We want to emphasize that there's much unknown about what happened this morning and why it happened. Here now is an animated sequence. This is animation showing how the launch should have gone. At 2 minutes into the flight, the shuttle's 2 boosters, the solid rocket boosters, should separate from the spacecraft itself. That would be 2 minutes in. The spacecraft never got to that point. The boosters would plunge into the ocean after they'd done their job of helping get the spaceship headed toward orbit, and they'd be retrieved for further use, those solid rocket boosters. And now that's how today's launch, a Space Shuttle Challenger, should have gone. Instead, this is what happens, or appears to have happened. At less than 2 minutes into the flight, at about 1 minute and 12 seconds, there was an explosion. After what seemed to be an ordinary launch, the explosion seems to be on the right side of one of those solid launch boosters, solid rocket fuel boosters. Pieces of the 100-ton spacecraft began to come down into the water about 28 miles downrange from the launch site. The first explosion seemed to be in one of the solid rocket fuel boosters. The next explosion consumed the liquid fuel on which the space shuttle rides and consumed the whole space shuttle, the solid rocket boosters, the liquid fuel tank, and the space shuttle itself. Bruce Hall at Cape Canaveral now has more on what may have happened to the engines. Bruce?
Dan, we have been operating on the theory, although we have heard absolutely nothing from NASA about this, but the first people who were reviewing the tape, just as you have been saying, it appeared there was a possible small explosion or some type of ignition in the solid rocket booster, and then there was a major explosion in the...
And for the launch on Sunday morning, and they were criticized on Sunday for being overly careful. Safety has always been foremost in their minds. And we woke up on Sunday morning after having canceled at 10 o'clock the night before to a perfect morning. It was beautiful, sunny, clear blue skies, perfect launch, and there was a lot of talk that rather irritated me. Well, NASA was overly cautious. And so, no, I don't think that's true at all.
What happens in your subcommittee now in terms of funding for the program?
Well, I can't answer that question exactly because of Graham Rudman and the other budget constraints, but I certainly have no intentions other than to push on and that does not change the intent or the progress of the program.
How do you think the investigation ought to be handled, Senator? Should there be some sort of blue ribbon panel put together, or should NASA be allowed to handle it?
Well, I think NASA has the technical experts, and if they need more than in-house, they will pull them in. I don't think we need to go outside that other than to draw on consultants if necessary. NASA is so thorough and so careful. If any of you had experienced how they go through the redundancy and the backups and careful nature, the dedication of these scientists and engineers in NASA, I have full faith in them. They want the program to succeed. They want to take care of their astronauts. It's always a real team effort. They work closely together, and they will want to find out what happened more than anybody else.
Senator, how lucky did you feel today that you returned safely?
Well, I don't feel particularly lucky. I think the program is reliable. In all programs, in flight test programs for aircraft, we have accidents, and I don't. It's a surprise to me that it happened, but I would go again tomorrow. If NASA would let me go, I would go again.
What effect is this likely to have on the community of astronauts?
Well, first of all, they're all such a close-knit group. They're not looking any beyond today except the sorrow of losing some of their companions. You go through each one. I knew Krista McAuliffe the least of them because she wasn't there. Greg Jarvis I trained with, Dick Scobie I knew, Mike Smith was my mother hen, and you go on Azuka flew in January last year when I was flying, so it's and where they live together all the time, they train together, they fly together. There's obviously utter shock and disbelief down at Houston today among the astronaut corps.
On your mission, was the crew equipped with parachutes and were there ejection seats?
No. Only Columbia had them at the beginning of the mission, just during the first, I don't remember, 3 or 4 missions.
Senator Jake Garn.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Jake Garn from Utah, one of the Congress's most astute and devoted overseers of NASA, giving us really the first feel we have this morning from an individual of what it's like to be on the shuttle. We have heard it many times before from many people, but there is Senator Garn emphasizing some very important things. First of all, that he would go again if NASA would have a chance, that he feels safer in the air than he does on the roads of America, that he feels the country should emphasize safe driving. And making the point, at the risk of paraphrasing him, that man does not explore the heavens without some kind of risk. That risk leading this morning to the loss of 7 Americans, including 2 women, including the first teacher in space, in a catastrophic explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger, just as it was approaching that moment of separation when the solid rocket boosters fall away and the Challenger pushes on for its first orbit in space.
Get into their proper telemetry for flight. We are seeing now a picture of Mission Control. There is absolutely nothing happening in there right now. The people are glued to whatever information they can get off of their monitors. There are very few muscles twitching. Now, as you see there, right under the word Houston, that is where the flight director sits. He is the man who is in complete charge of this, and you can see them just sitting there waiting for the analysis through their computers of the computer information and the telemetry information that they were getting at the time. Behind the flight director is seated the flight operations director. He is the man that communicates with the NASA administration during these launches.
Yeah, Dan, if you were listening to Senator Garn, as I know that you were, it does appear that what happened is they went to full throttle to 104% on those main engines at the back of the spacecraft that are fueled by that big external tank. That's the orange tank that you see, 560,000 pounds of oxygen and hydrogen, as they push down, in effect, to go to full throttle as they were lifting off into their orbit, they hope. That appears to be the moment when everything went wrong, when the explosion had occurred. And of course, if there was any malfunction whatsoever, that big external tank is a bomb in effect. And that's really what it is. It's a huge external tank filled with a highly volatile material. And it appears that's when things went tragically very wrong indeed.
Yes, Tom, indeed. As we were hearing from Bob Bazell and Roy Neal earlier on, the astronauts knew, they all know that something like this was possible with the shuttle. When you talk to them privately, anywhere along through the Space Shuttle program, they would tell you something big is going to happen one day. If it's not a main engine, something serious is going to happen, and we know it, and we're willing to take the risk, Tom.
All right, thanks, Dan Molina. Now to the White House and Chris Wallace, who has been able to talk with President Reagan. Chris?
Well, Tom, the President came into the Roosevelt Room across the hall from the Oval Office just a few moments ago to give us his thoughts about this tragedy. He said that he had no more information than we did, hard information as to what had gone on down in at Cape Canaveral, but all indications seem to be, and the way both he and his top aides were talking was that as if they believe that all 7 of the people on board the shuttle are dead. Let me give you some of the questions and answers in a brief on-the-record, off-camera session that the president had with reporters. He said, it's a horrible thing all of us have witnessed. I can't rid myself of the thought of the sacrifice of the families who were there at the Cape and watching this tragedy also. I can't help but think what they must be going through. He then said that he has no more information, although the White House is now on an open line to NASA, that he and his top aides have no more information basically than we are getting from NASA through the public information officer. He was asked whether or not he's going to halt all systems, all space flights of the shuttle until he finds out what happened. He said, I do have confidence in the people running the program. This is the first fatal accident in 56 flights. Obviously, we want to find out what happened and so that it won't happen again, and I'm sure that there will be no more flights until the flight controllers are absolutely certain of what went wrong and how to repair it. He said, you know, in the past, some of us have gotten a bit impatient with all of the holds in these flights and wondered whether perhaps the flight controllers were a little overzealous, a little too careful. He said, today we tragically found out that, no, that we do need those precautions. As to the fact that a private citizen, Krista McAuliffe, the teacher from New Hampshire, was on board this flight, he said, look, all 7 of those people are citizens. All 7 of them were volunteers. No one goes on that space flight who wasn't very much interested and very much desirous of getting a coveted seat on the shuttle. He said that the space program is basically the last frontier. I guess we have become so confident that things would go right that it comes as an especially great shock when suddenly something goes so terribly wrong. He said that he will go ahead with a State of the Union message tonight saying that things like that have to go on. We have to go on governing the nation, but he said that obviously there will be a reference to this tragedy during his speech tonight to a joint session of Congress. As for any backlash against the space shuttle, he said no, accidents happen in every line of transportation, and obviously up till now the space shuttle's safety record was perfect. As to who brought him the news, he said that he was in the Oval Office preparing for a background briefing he was going to have with reporters when Vice President Bush and National Security Advisor John Poindexter came in and handed him a note saying that the space shuttle had exploded, no further details. Then the President, Bush, and Poindexter all went to a small study that the President has just off the Oval Office, and like everybody else, turned on their TV to see what was happening, watched, to their horror, tape replays of the explosion. He called it a, quote, very traumatic experience. He said that this will indeed cast a pall on his speech tonight, which he had hoped to use as an opportunity to push his program for the next legislative year. But he said that while they will mention it, you have to go on governing the nation. As for Krista McAuliffe, and there was a certain bitter irony in this because Krista McAuliffe was named to the space program several months ago in the Roosevelt room, the room where we were all with the president, and at that time it was, of course, a great source of pride to Mr. Reagan, who had come up with the idea of putting a teacher in space. He said that I can't get out of my mind the thought of her husband and her children who were watching as the shuttle exploded. He said, of course, all the other families, many of them were also there, but they, as test pilots, the families of test pilots were more aware of the dangers of this program. He said, knowing that they were there and watching, your heart goes out to them. One other footnote, Tom, we have been told that Mrs. Reagan was upstairs in the family quarters alone and just happened to have the TV set on and was watching live when the flight lifted off and said, oh my God, no, and was very upset when she saw live the terrible tragedy.
Thank you. Chris Wallace of the White House today, and as he indicated, the State of the Union address will go on tonight as scheduled before a joint session of Congress at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. NBC News will have coverage of that, and we'll have continuing coverage all day long here. This enormous tragedy involving the Space Shuttle Challenger, all 7 crew members on board, including the school teacher, Krista McAuliffe, appeared to have perished in a giant explosion that occurred 2 minutes after liftoff today, about 18 miles downrange, about 5 miles up in the air. There are recovery crews now in the area, but so far no word from them. They couldn't even enter the area for a time because there was so much debris falling. The most arresting picture so far today, in addition to the explosion itself, occurred at the Cape, where Krista McAuliffe's husband and her 2 children were watching, along with her parents, Ed and Grace Corrigan of Framingham, Massachusetts. They stood silently during the launch, not entirely sure of what they were seeing, I'm confident. They remained standing together as the loudspeaker brought that chilling announcement. There appears to have been a major malfunction. The vehicle has exploded, it was then, they were then told, and Mrs. Corrigan, that is Krista McAuliffe's mother, looked at the NASA official and repeated his words as a question. The vehicle has exploded.
Tom?
This was to have been a triumphant day, of course, for Krista McAuliffe. She was selected by this administration as the first school teacher to go in space, and Dan Molina now remembers a happier time when, in fact, that selection was made.
For the 10 finalists, all the testing, training, and dreaming was over. It all came down to this one moment in the White House. First, Vice President Bush announced the backup for the flight, Barbara Morgan of McCall, Idaho. Then, for 36-year-old Sharon Krista McAuliffe of Concord, New Hampshire, the dream came true.
It's not often that a teacher is at a loss for words. I know my students wouldn't think so. I've made 9 wonderful friends over the last 2 weeks. And when that shuttle goes, there might be one body. But there's going to be 10 souls that I'm taking with me.
This is home in New Hampshire, all spruced up for Krista's return, despite the fact that 5-year-old daughter Caroline doesn't like the whole business.
Because I don't want to go in space, because I just want to stay around my house.
Husband Steve heard the news on the radio.
Everybody who knows her, I think, honestly thought that, you know, there may have been candidates who were certainly her equal, but that there was nobody that would be superior to her.
McAuliffe has already had a taste of what space flight will be like. This was a ride in a plane that simulates zero gravity. She'll now go through 114 hours of intensive training. That's, of course, a fraction of what astronauts go through, but enough so she can get along as she takes the flight and records her thoughts in a journal. What, she was asked, does she look forward to most?
Seeing the Earth, seeing the perspective of the Earth, and just being able to see the planet. I mean, you see it in pictures, but be able to see that in reality is going to be wonderful. I do plan to go back to teaching. This is not a career, but it's an unbelievable experience.
Dan Molina, NBC News, Washington.
And apparently it was her last experience, because although we have no confirmation, there is no indication whatsoever that there were any survivors in the crash today of the Space Shuttle Challenger, 2 minutes downrange, about 4.5 miles up in the air. John Palmer's in New York now. John?
Yes, Tom, some of the first rescue teams have apparently arrived on the scene or very near the scene where there was the splashdown of at least the large pieces of the Space Shuttle Challenger and the rocket boosters. They report back that no significant pieces of the shuttle have been found in the water. There is no evidence of any survivors. One theory that is being looked at, we are told, as just a theory by NASA, is that there could have been a rupture in the seam. And Tom, you alluded to this a few minutes ago when they went to a full power at about 1 minute into the flight. There could have been a rupture of the seam from the spacecraft and the solid booster rocket. That right at this point there could have been a tearing when the rocket went into great acceleration, its fastest point. But of course that is mere projection or supposition at this point, but it's something we're told they're looking into. And earlier, as we have mentioned, there was a delay of a couple of hours down at the Cape for the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger. This because of icicles that appeared on the body of the spacecraft because it was below 32 degrees this morning in Florida. They talked about that a while. They even removed some of those icicles. They were greatly concerned that during liftoff some of these icicles might break off and damage some of those very sensitive tiles on the spacecraft, tiles that are needed for re-entry. But they knocked off some of those icicles. They really didn't think it was any great concern to worry about. There's one other thing that observers at the Cape noticed that was a bit different about the liftoff of this flight, and that was observers say it seemed to be a slower liftoff than they'd ever seen before. I was watching it live, and it seemed to me, I thought, in fact, I said out loud to a group who were watching it with me, there must have been a shutdown here. There seemed to be an interminably long time before actually it cleared the pad. That will not be supposition very long because they have all the data there in the computers to check that out. But a number of theories are being considered at this point. Tom?
Thank you, John. Well, it's not unusual for it to look as if it's lifting off very slowly, and of course all the telemetry, all the signals that NASA said it had at that point were normal, so we don't know whether that in fact had anything to do with it. The big external tank, however, is itself a very thin-skinned vessel is really what it is. It holds all that oxygen and hydrogen, and when they do separate, it just breaks up. They don't recover that. They recover the two solid rocket boosters, which are on either side. So it is something that could come apart without too much difficulty. Bob Bazell, who's been covering the Space Shuttle program since its inception now, is at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. Bob, you and I have been talking about this business of going up in the Space Shuttle because we both have been applicants in the journalist program, and we've been talking about what was required. Tell me a little bit about what the people in Houston and really at Cape Canaveral have said to you about what is required in terms of the kind of people that they will put in that cockpit.
Well, interestingly enough, Tom, the Space Shuttle program was said before today's tragedy to have evolved to the point that almost anybody could have gone up. In fact, one astronaut told me that all you really need to know to go up in the shuttle is how to get out in a hurry that's on the ground, and let's get back to that in a minute, and how to use the toilet in the air. And other than that, it was supposed to be a program where just people could be passengers. Now, it is interesting. I think we should probably talk again, as you were mentioning before, about what the emergency procedures were, because I think that people who aren't as familiar with it, who haven't been watching it that closely, might not understand. There was no emergency escape exit ejection capsule anymore on the shuttle. There was, as you mentioned, as Senator Garn mentioned, in the early days of the program, there were ejection seats for the pilot and the co-pilot. But as the number of people in the crew began to grow, as some of them began to ride downstairs, NASA decided that that was just impractical, and they concentrated on two ways of escaping. One is if something went wrong on the ground, they would scramble out and go down a wire. The other thing was if something happened in the air, they would try to land it either back at a runway at the Cape or, as you mentioned before, to go on to Spain or to try to go once around the world and land at Edwards Air Force Base. So those were the only methods of escape. Now, it appeared from the tape that we've looked at over and over again that there was such an explosion that it wouldn't have mattered what kind of precautions they had. It's also interesting to point out, and where everything as we keep saying, is speculative at this point, that as you also mentioned, that the external fuel tank that contained that massive amounts of liquid hydrogen and oxygen, essentially a gigantic bomb, is the only part of the space shuttle that's not reusable. So each time they go up, they have a new one. So if we were looking at something that possibly had a defect, that could have been it.
Bob, we're going to look at the tape now once again in slow motion. And this is 1 minute and 15 seconds downrange. There is the explosion. As you can see, it was massive.
It's very difficult to see from the extent of the explosion what might have been involved, because obviously the flames just...
Pause for a second and ponder the faces of the 7 people who were aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger this morning. The $1.2 billion spacecraft, one of 4 in NASA's shuttle fleet, was destroyed, completely obliterated. Parts of the ship fell into the Atlantic about 18 miles southeast of the launch pad. On a slow-motion video rerun of the explosion, as we've shown you, it was difficult to determine the exact source of the explosion. Bruce Hall passed along the theories put forward by veteran observers there. One theory was that the explosion began in one of the solid rocket fuel boosters attached to the side of the main fuel tank. Another of the theories put forward was that the explosion had happened, began very near where the solid rocket booster is attached to the main liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen fuel tank. Liquid hydrogen, keep in mind, is highly explosive. And there was one theory, after looking closely at the slow-motion videotape replay, that the early part of the explosion actually happened in the main fuel tank near where a seam is there. It was difficult to determine, to say the least, the exact source of the explosion, but unmistakably, when the huge fuel tank with nearly 500,000, 500,000 gallons of volatile propellant ruptured, it did tear the Challenger into many, many pieces. NASA said the fine pieces of debris continued to fall into the impact area for nearly 45 minutes. It took 45 minutes before all of the debris, or large portions of it, came down in extremely small pieces. Recovery boats and aircraft were dispatched to the area. They had to wait until the debris stopped raining before they could get into that ocean area to make a search. Paramedics leaped into the water in an effort, they parachuted down in an effort to find any trace of survivors. There is no word of any survivors. After the explosion, the 2 solid fuel rocket booster rockets did separate out and continued to fly crazily out of control in the clear sky. They were both trailing long trails of smoke before they plummeted into the water. One of those solid rocket boosters was seen floating down on its parachute. Recall, that's the way that if a launch goes well, both of these solid rocket boosters are supposed to fall away, fall down in the ocean by parachute, and be recovered and used again. The big tank, the main fuel tank, the one with the liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen, those are not reusable. On previous launches, once the launch goes off well, that big tank drops away and somewhere over the Indian Ocean and is not recovered. Television pictures of the impact area relayed from a helicopter showed no evidence of any large pieces of debris floating in the water. Those are those shots from the helicopter that we've been showing you throughout our coverage. The launch had been delayed repeatedly, most recently because of fears that icicles on the launch pad could harm the shuttle. And as Bruce Hall reported from Cape Canaveral earlier, the launch was delayed about 2 hours this morning while they made an icicle check. That was because of the 28-degree temperature, very unusual for Florida this time of year, that prevailed overnight in Florida. Leslie Stahl, one of our White House correspondents, has been working at the White House this morning along with Bill Plant, our other veteran White House correspondent. Leslie, is there any late word about the president and what he knows?
Yes, Dan. First, let me tell you that there is an assumption here at the White House that
3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go with throttle up. Challenger, go with throttle up.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
And as you can see there, the explosion occurred just as the astronauts put the throttle up on the Challenger itself. The shuttle was 9 miles in the air when it exploded. NASA has parachuted paramedics into the area of the Atlantic where the shuttle went down, although they don't expect to find survivors. This was to have been the second of a record 15 shuttle flights NASA had planned for this year. We have more from Steve Delaney.
In terms of looking ahead at where NASA goes from here, it was probably also a good idea to look back a little bit, because this was the 25th lift. This was the 10th time for the workhorse of the fleet, the Challenger. And they had accomplished a great number of things. They had laid to rest, by putting civilians up in the air, they had laid to rest some of the mystique that was built up around the early NASA astronauts. You no longer had to be a test pilot. You no longer had to be a specialist in one sort or another. You could be, and today was, for the first time, included in the crew, an ordinary citizen. And we're looking at pictures now that indicate how difficult it is going to be to find and recover and make sense of what happened this morning. The pieces, they say, have still been raining down from the sky. They came from a long way up. The smaller ones, the ones that are made basically out of scrap sheet metal. The heavier pieces, they gave us an impact time and point a long while back. Not very, in fact, the heavier pieces, Tom, seemed to come down almost as fast as they went up, which was quite fast indeed. NASA does have a helicopter, which is part of the coverage pattern that they have for showing us the pictures of the launch early on, and that camera is now out over the search area taking a look, and there's just an awful lot of blank space out there, and the chances of finding anything that would tune up the hearts of people who are worried about the crew are pretty remote. But Tom, it just seems that whatever started so well, I mean, the luck tends to go in cycles, and they'd had a run of bad luck and a run of delays for sometimes seemingly silly reasons, but this morning everything looked so well that it just was that much more unexpected when this flight ended in such tragedy.
As soon as the news of the shuttle crash broke this morning, White House spokesman Larry Speaks held a news conference. Officials, understandably, have been stunned.
Quite frankly, the president stood there in almost stunned silence as he watched the television. You could certainly read the concern, the sorrow, the anxiety on his face as he watched, and the group watched around him. As I say, he was virtually watched in silence.
Might anyone from the White House be leading some sort of investigating team, or will it just be up to NASA to investigate this?
All this.
And those, some of the school children, with their caps on.
Throttling up, 3 engines now to 104%. Challenger, go and throttle up. Challenger, go and throttle up.
Her mother clearly weeping with pride at that point. Those children
those the
at the Cape itself, very much like the children who had watched at Krista McAuliffe's school in New Hampshire, as described to us, for minutes did not know what was happening. It looked very much to us as if her parents did not know what was happening for some period of time.
Stay on it.
John Quinones, ABC's correspondent at the Cape, said to us earlier that in fact many people who were watching at the Cape did not know what was going on.
Stay on them. Stay on them.
More as we have information available. Again, I repeat, we have a report relayed through the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. We are now looking at all the contingency operations and waiting
Can't find it here.
Krista McAuliffe, the first pure civilian, the first teacher in space, with her parents and lots of children in attendance from her school at Cape Canaveral today. 24 space missions had already been accomplished before tragedy occurred on this one. And at 3 o'clock this afternoon, the space agency is going to hold a news conference to try to explain to us what they know. We don't know what they know in terms of what went wrong in this, the world's first reusable spacecraft. ABC's Lynn Scher is standing by with us in Los Angeles. Lynn, what do they look for first? I'm sorry, but what do they look for first?
Well, Peter, I think the first thing they're going to have to do is analyze that tape. They've got to be able to look at it. I assume they will enhance it with a computer, look at it as closely as they can to try to pinpoint where the first flash was, where the explosion took place. I know you've been through this a few times.
That's 15 seconds.
That's the external tank, the orange tank that you see in the background, and we believe, based on our own speculation, that that may have been the source of the problem. It fuels those engines. Those are the main engines at the bottom of the spacecraft, which is a kind of engine with an airplane with short wings. Everything is normal here.
Of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Roger, roll, Challenger.
Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange.
I'm waiting to get the Russians and the insurance.
Engines beginning throttling down now.
Those are the solid rocket boosters, the long white rockets on either side. They are supposed to separate, and then they are recovered by a parachute, and the plane, the space shuttle itself, goes on into orbit under normal conditions.
Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs.
APUs are auxiliary power units. Engines at 65%.
57 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
Now he's going to tell me to go to full throttle, and that's when it happens.
Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up. Challenger, go at throttle up.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
And there it was. an eerie, tragic beauty in the skies over Florida today. Tragedy of enormous proportions. 7 people killed, we believe. Their families obviously deeply affected, as is the nation, as is the space program. Here it is in slow-mo. It's hard to imagine that anyone could have survived that. The only solid piece of debris we see is the solid rocket booster off to the side. There were no astronauts in that, of course. The Space Shuttle Challenger itself seems to have come apart. Debris fell into the ocean. Recovery vessels were quickly in place, but they couldn't enter the recovery area because the debris continued to fall. They're there now. We've not heard how they're doing at this point. We do expect Senator John Glenn in the Senate gallery within 5 minutes or so. Of course, Senator Glenn is a veteran astronaut. He was the first American to make an orbital flight of the Earth back in the early days of the space program and the Mercury capsule. John Palmer is in New York with additional information for us. John?
Yes, Tom, the Soviet news agency TASS has now made mention of this, just one line on it. The U.S. Space Shuttle Challenger exploded shortly after takeoff today. There is no comment. The Soviet Union, of course, is the only other country that has sent people up into space, and the Soviet Union has, of course, reported the death of 4 Soviet cosmonauts. Prior to today, 3 American astronauts had lost their lives. There is this word, according to a spokesman for Lloyd's of London, all of the crew members of the shuttle flights are offered the opportunity for life insurance written by Lloyd's of London, and a spokesman for Lloyd's of London says that only one of the astronauts, and that was Krista McAuliffe, the school teacher, took advantage of that life insurance. She took out a policy of $1 million on her life. She, along with the other 6 members of the Space Shuttle Challenger, now presumed to have been lost shortly after 11:30 this morning, when the Space Shuttle Columbia exploded about a minute after launch from Cape Canaveral. Let's go back now to Washington and Tom Brokaw. Tom?
Thank you, John Palmer. There is a problem, and we hope before the afternoon is out to deal with some people who will be here to help you as you deal with your children. We hope to have a child psychologist, because a lot of children have been watching the space program, including the students of Krista McAuliffe. Now at the Senate Gallery on Capitol Hill, Senator John Glenn.
But the people that were on the flight today carried our hopes and dreams along with them, and they'll live forever in our memories. And I guess that's the best tribute we can give to them. Our prayers, our sympathy, our condolences go out to their families and friends, and I guess that's about all we can say about them right at this time. It's been an amazing success story up to this very tragic accident today. I think this was, what, the 56th or 57th manned mission, where we're dealing with new complexities and speeds and powers that man has never used before. And we had hoped to push this day back.
Offices, homes, and businesses across the continent, almost everyone has scrambled to get to the nearest television set, where the spectacular, horrifying pictures were almost immediately broadcast. Calgarians stood in silence, shocked, stunned, and saddened. On the minds of many, the U.S. school teacher on her first flight, who was to broadcast her lessons from space. Across Calgary, the business of the day has been forgotten. For the first time in the history of the U.S. space program, a space vehicle has blown up in flight. None of the 7 astronauts aboard Challenger appear to have survived. Calgarians have joined the rest of the continent, anxiously awaiting further news.
Oh, that's pretty bad. I don't know, I guess it's had to happen sometime. It's quite a spaceship they have there, and a lot of things to go wrong.
The school teacher and, I don't know, the astronauts and their families just can't believe it happened.
I just watched it here.
Shocked?
Yes, it's incredible. It's a disaster that is going to be a severe setback for the shuttle program.
Murray Cunningham, CFCN News.
The Calgary Aerospace Museum has been patched into the shuttle missions for some time and was receiving the telecast live this morning when the accident occurred. Shuttle show director Phil Parks saw it happen live.
My first indication that something was wrong, although I had a feeling in the pit of my stomach that something wasn't right here. They'd lost downlink, and that doesn't happen. It never happens. If they lose downlink, they know they're losing downlink. And there was no indication. The computers indicated no problem. It just happened, just like the flick of a light switch.
What was your reaction?
Well, much like anyone's, I guess, I felt sick. I mean, it's devastating, a brutal thing.
Initial impression from those watching the launch were that 2 parachutes had come out of the shuttle. Those were parachutes from paramedics rushing to the scene. Here's a look at the recovery area about an hour ago.
We are seeing live pictures here of the recovery area. Some of the rescue ships and helicopters are now on the scene attempting to find pieces of the wreckage from the shuttle.
We understand from early reports, Lloyd, that the wreckage from the crash is strewn over quite a considerable area. However, it is within the Cape Canaveral range, so there were a variety of rescue craft on the water, and as we saw earlier, some paramedics were actually parachuted into the scene to see if there were, in fact, any survivors.
Barely 2 minutes after the shuttle disaster, the Toronto and New York stock exchanges saw rallies become losses. The TSE lists several aerospace contractors. Spar, builder of the Canada arm, plummeted $1.25 before recovering to $24.50. At midday, the TSE 300 was off 2.15 points.
Possibly have happened to have gone wrong with the Space Shuttle Challenger today when it exploded after liftoff. And at this point, perhaps we should listen into that conversation to see if there are any new hints as to just what could have gone wrong.
He has been covering it for NBC radio and occasionally television for a good deal longer than that. You've seen death here before. You've seen explosions before. You were here when that little grapefruit-sized thing blew up back about, what, 57, the first time we tried to get something up in the air.
It's December the 6th, right? 57.
And in all that time, you probably have learned more about how these things work and why they're so careful than anybody else. What does all that knowledge lead you to today in terms of trying to figure out what did happen here?
Well, Steve, it's difficult to understand that it could have happened because all these systems are fed through computers before they lift off, and all the computers have to write them off, have to say everything is fine. In fact, the flight controllers in Houston, they were saying that everything was fine. No one saw anything. But as we look at the videotape as it goes back, it's apparent what happened was that the explosion started at the base of the huge external fuel tank. And you
that
have
big
to...
silo thing,
right.
and the space vehicle sits on it like a butterfly on a tree stump.
That's right. It's hanging beneath it. They're going into orbit underneath at this time. Now, the ducts that come out of the big tank feed into the engines, and I believe we're getting ready to look at it now. We just missed it. Anyway, they feed into the engines, and it appeared from what we can see on the videotape that that's where the explosion began. Something happened there in the big ducts going from the tank into the engines themselves, and it was right after Dick Scobie was told to go for throttle up, which means they have passed through the maximum dynamic pressure and they're ready to start feeding more throttle.
So they're up through most of the atmosphere and they're heading for outer space at that point then. And your look at that suggests to you that it was indeed that big liquid fuel bomb that took out the rest of it in just an instant as they were getting back into high gear to climb out. Climb out of the top.
That's exactly what happened. And then the 2 solids went off to the side. We watched those. We saw them continue to burn.
We did see that. Now, where does this program go from here? Is this a crippling or a slow-down blow?
It's definitely a slow-down blow. They had scheduled 15 launches this year, 13 from here, 2 from Vandenberg. The shuttle, none of them will fly again until...
Jay, let me ask you about the recovery effort. You're familiar with the kinds of things that they put out over the water, and they used to do it in drills all the time. What happens if we have to drop into the water? Well, there are recovery vehicles. But with all that water and bits of debris raining down for 15 minutes after the explosion, what do you expect them to come back with?
Well, I expect a core of some sort of the vehicle is on the bottom of the Atlantic now, and possibly the bodies of the 7 crew members are in that cabin. And if it was not far enough, they say it's 18 miles east of here, it's not off the continental shelf, then it is in water that is shallow enough that they can retrieve the bodies. I think this is what they're looking at this time. They're hoping at least a core of the vehicle did remain. However, we did not see anything but a lot of debris coming down. The two pieces that you see on the videotape, the largest pieces that remain, were the two solid booster rockets.
All right, so you would have expected, if the orbiter, if the Challenger came down intact, you would have expected to see it, at least in that long-range television shot, after the explosion.
That's correct, Steve.
And you did not? Nobody
did not see it. I don't think anyone did.
All right, Steve Mallory of NBC News and James Barbary going over what available information they have. They're at the Cape, and while there has been no official comment from officials from NASA, it's clear that some of the reporters are able to get, at least on a background basis, some idea from those officials as to what at least their thinking is at this point. In a way, perhaps an optimistic report from Barbary that perhaps as much as a quarter of the vehicle remained. It seems, certainly from those pictures, extremely unlikely that anything of that size managed to get through the explosion. However, as we did see earlier in the pictures we talked about, part of one of the solid fuel or solid booster rockets exiting the scene of the explosion apparently intact. It now appears there were two. You heard Barbary talking about them, and he makes that comment after looking at pictures like this. Let's have a look at these now. Once again, more analysis of the explosion itself. Now, if we can... we have the ability to slow these down. You saw one exit the scene of one of the solid booster rockets exit the scene there. It's just leaving the scene of that explosion. Okay, hold it there. All right, I guess this is what they're getting at.
Something else going off there to the
off
left of the
towards
picture.
the left, up towards the top of the picture.
Something clearly that is fired in some way. So there should be.
Now I think that's what they're going on, and that in fact is. If you stop it again there now, I think you can. It's clear that that little hook to the top is in fact another one of the other solid. That's it, circled there on your screen. The other solid. If you stop that there, you can see that that one is intact. That's clearly one of the solid booster rockets attached to the main fuel tank. Now, I obviously don't want to try to get too technical here because neither Eve nor I will pretend to know the full technology or anything getting close to the full technology of how this program works. But basically, when the shuttle program, Shuttle Challenger lifts off, there are four main pieces of equipment that you're looking at. You're looking at the shuttle itself attached to the major fuel tank, that enormous orange tank that's attached to the bottom of the shuttle itself, and at the sides of it, two solid booster rockets. Now that's what's circled there, the two booster rockets exiting the scene of the explosion. Now at this particular point, that's all that's known. The explosion in the center of your picture, two booster rockets exiting the scene of the explosion, apparently intact. But as for the shuttle carrying the 7 astronauts and the major fuel tank itself, it appears at this particular moment that all that's left of them is in that rapidly exploding ball of smoke and flame in the center of that particular picture. Earlier we talked, you saw comments from Congressman Jake Garn, who had been on one of the earlier shuttle missions. Perhaps the most famous astronaut turned politician in the United States is Senator John Glenn, who was on board one of the first manned missions. I think I'm correct in saying he was the first American astronaut to actually orbit the Earth. He is a senator and was briefly, anyway, a presidential candidate in the 1984 presidential elections in the United States. However, today, of course, on his mind, the awful events that happened at Cape Kennedy today. He talked to reporters, I believe, in Washington, and we're going to hear his comments now. This is Senator John Glenn talking about today's horrible events at Cape Kennedy.
But
The President, in addition, has asked the Vice President to go immediately to Cape Canaveral's Kennedy Space Center, along with the acting NASA Director, Bill Graham. The Vice President will carry with him the President's personal concern for those courageous Americans who were aboard the Space Shuttle. In addition, the President will speak to the American people from the Oval Office later this evening regarding this tragedy. The President, since learning of the tragedy shortly before noon, has conferred with Don Regan, who in turn consulted with Speaker Tip O'Neill and Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole, they concurred in the President's decision to delay his State of the Union. A few moments ago, the President met in the Oval Office with NASA Director Graham and instructed him to fly to the Cape with the Vice President to begin an effort to find out the cause of this tragedy. And then the President said to go forward with the nation's space program. The President said, and I quote, "These people were dedicated to the exploration of space. We could do no more to honor them, these courageous Americans, than to go forward with the program."
Can you tell us some of the reasoning in the decision to postpone, since, as you know, the President's first reaction was to go ahead with tonight's speech?
I think the President, like all Americans, has seen this tragedy unfold on television and has felt keenly what those family members must have felt watching that shuttle go into the air at the Cape, first pride and then second horror. The President feels that these same emotions are being experienced by people all over this nation at this moment. And with the consultation of Congress that's taken place in the last hour or so, the President thought it was entirely appropriate that his State of the Union be deferred until, and let him address the American people on what's happening here tonight.
Administrator Graham tell him finally what happened? Does he have information, confirmation?
No, the NASA has issued a statement indicating simply that there was an explosion aboard the Space Shuttle shortly after it lifted off from the Cape this morning, and that a search and rescue mission is underway. That is continuing at this hour and will continue until all efforts to find out what the situation in there are exhausted.
Does the President believe...
Right. Right.
Larry, is the President also going to cancel his State of the Union activities for the balance of the weekend? What time is the other remarks tonight?
The President will, will for the balance of the week continue on his previously announced schedule, with the exception of those activities which were designed as a follow-up to the State of the Union. They will be rescheduled for next week. The time of the address to the nation has not been determined, pending definite word from NASA about the situation.
HHS, Treasury, and the high school he is not going to visit now.
That's right.
Larry, can you
Let's
tell
go
us,
one at a
does
time.
the President have any plans to travel or attend any memorial service for the...
Well, at the moment, the NASA is still conducting its search mission there, and of course there's been no memorial service set. The Vice President does go with the personal expression on the part of the President of his concern to those families there, and no travel plans are set as yet.
Larry, two questions. First of all, I know you haven't had any official word, but is the White House operating on the basis that all of the people on the shuttle are dead?
Well, Chris, like every American, we hope, and until we find out otherwise, that hope will continue.
And secondly, to follow up on an earlier question, we were told by the President a few moments ago that he intended to go ahead with the State of the Union. In fact, said while it would cast a pall, the business of governing the nation must go on. What changed his mind in really a very short period of time?
Well, as I indicated to your colleague over here just a moment ago, is that the President, like all Americans, watched this on television, and he felt very keenly the emotion that must be felt by the families of those down there and that had to watch this event in person, and very keenly what the American people must be feeling. He consulted with the congressional leadership, and the consensus opinion of the executive and the legislative branch was that it was appropriate to postpone.
Larry, can you tell us what information the President is getting other than from television at this point?
Well, as I just said, the President has conferred with the director of NASA, and he brought him up to date, providing him with as much information as he can. There is not an extensive body of information at the moment that exists. NASA is looking into it as quickly as they can, and as I say, a search mission goes on.
Is there a special task force either at the White House or somewhere that's keeping him informed, or are there special communications channels set up?
As is always, when there is an event of this nature that occurs anywhere around the world, the White House Situation Room keeps on top of the events. What happened was, as soon as this event occurred almost simultaneously with the television coverage of it, the Situation Room was informed by NASA and has kept abreast of it with an open line to NASA at the Cape since that time.
Was this Well, I was going to go back again on where the idea of postponing the speech first initiated. Did the president initiate
Yes, the president initiated the idea of postponing the speech.
Sorry, will the shuttle program be suspended at least until the investigation is through?
Those determinations have not been made. The president indicated to Bill Graham that he should find out the cause of it and then proceed. Now, exactly how that dovetails with future flights will just have to be determined as a result of what NASA determines in their investigation.
So on the consideration of whether any civilians will be permitted to continue on shuttle flights, is that also part of the investigation?
Well, to echo the president's words that all of these people were Americans. They were all interested in space. They all came first with courage and second in a spirit of volunteering for this mission. And whether there'll be any change in that, I don't know. But at the moment, I don't think there's any inclination. Joe?
Has the president attempted to contact the family members of anyone who was on the
The president has not yet done that, no, except to send the vice president in expression of his concern.
Is there any feeling here that NASA was pushing too hard? There was a very ambitious program. Was it 15 launches for this year?
I think NASA has a very good record of safety and a very cautious human approach to space exploration, and they have taken those precautions. This is a tragedy of major proportions and one that concerns us all. But for the moment, there is no finger pointing at NASA as far as their safety record.
Well, the question arises particularly because in recent launches there have been some glitches that have come up. As you know, they had a problem with the door, the hatch on this, and their drill wouldn't work and all of that. Does that not give the impression that they may be pushing too fast?
I can't make that judgment from here, but I think if you would look back at other space launches in the Mercury and Apollo program, you would find that there have been postponements. These not because of glitches, but because of an extensive safety program that finds these glitches before launch.
Can you be more specific about what the Vice President will be doing later today specifically, and also the postponement on the State of the Union pushed back the schedule for the budget and other things that were scheduled to next week?
The Vice President's schedule, once he arrives at the Cape, has not been determined, since it's just within the last few moments that the President has asked him to go down.
Well, what's his specific charge? I mean, when
his specific charge, once again, is to express the President's concern to the families and to accompany the Director of NASA down to the Cape in order to see that that the President's directions for an immediate look into the tragedy, into the explosion, is accomplished.
Is he overseeing an investigation into this?
I don't think that you can say that yet, Norm. I think this matter is entirely in the hands of the NASA people at the present time, and I don't know of any. There's no further planning beyond that. Question on the budget, that has not been determined. It would be my inclination to say that the budget will probably go up on Wednesday, with the State of the Union on Tuesday. I think the Graham-Rudman law requires that it go up by February 5th, and that they will do. Andrew, and then I'm going to go all the way to the back and work forward.
Just want to follow on Norm. Is it the President's view that perhaps an independent investigation outside of NASA is what is required on the pacing of the program? And
I think everyone is leapfrogging well ahead of events at present. This tragedy is now only hours old. You have a series of actions taken by the president, including a charge to the director of NASA to find out what happened. And until we do some preliminary studies, none of these questions have answers. So, Pat?
Has the decision been made to have the president officially disclose tonight in his speech what happened? Will we continue to get details from NASA throughout the day, or are they going to hold the president's speech?
NASA will continue to keep you abreast of everything as they know it, as they always have through the entire history of the American space program. So, John?
Larry, you made a point of saying early on that there would be no greater way to honor those who apparently have died in this mission than to continue on with the space program. Is this a deliberate effort to try to counteract any feelings against the program because of the tragedy?
John, the only deliberate effort we're making at the moment is to show our deep concern, our deep emotion, and our desire that America continue in the space program. That's our entire motive, lock, stock, and barrel. Joanne?
Larry, has the president expressed any rue or regret about his proposal to send civilians in space?
The president is obviously concerned about every person that he, as the chief executive officer of the government, he is the president, directs. He directs people every day, either directly or indirectly, to conduct missions on the part of the government, the military, NASA, and those. It's a fact of life when the man sits in the Oval Office. He has to make these decisions, and I have not heard him express any regret. Concern, yes. Deep emotion, yes. Sorrow, yes. But regret is not that. It was the decision made, as he said, these individuals are all Americans, and they're all believers in the space program, and that's what's in his mind. So, Walter?
Larry, does the president plan today to speak with any of the relatives, family of any of the...
That hasn't been determined yet, no. Frank?
Can you give us any indication as to what the First Lady was doing at the time that this information became available and what her reaction was?
I don't. We can check with her office, if you will, and see what we can get.
Because the Europeans are able to put up satellites in with unmanned vehicles, doesn't this accident argue per se that unmanned vehicles are a preferable way to put up satellites in orbit?
Once again, I have been a silent observer of the space program and not one that's actively involved, and I'm not competent to answer that.
All right. As you recall, the president made the decision to send a teacher into space. Can you tell us on what he based that decision and who suggested the timing and when the time was right for that mission?
Well, Mike, I don't want to come down hard on you, but what's in the president's mind right now is to find out what happened and to show those families of those people that he's concerned. And that's all that's on his mind at the moment.
Are you operating on the assumption that this is the result of some technological problem, or has anyone suggested the possibility it might be an act of terrorism?
There have been no suggestions either way.
Thank you.
Larry Speaks in the White House press briefing room, just completing that live briefing to reporters who are assembled there. He made several major announcements. The President's State of the Union address tonight has been postponed until Tuesday of next week. The White House saying that the President initiated that decision. We also had word from Capitol Hill that both House Speaker Thomas P. Tip O'Neill and the Senate Majority Leader Robert Dole of Kansas concurred in that decision, that there were efforts being made up there even before the White House came to its decision that they ought to, in fact, postpone tonight's State of the Union address. The President, however, will address the nation tonight from the Oval Office. The time, as of now, undetermined. As soon as we have that time for you, of course, we'll bring it to you. Vice President Bush and the administrator of NASA will be dispatched to the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral, Florida today, where they will be the President's personal representatives to determine what has happened there. It has now been about 2.5 hours since this tragedy occurred, this traumatic shock to the nation. 7 astronauts apparently lost in a gigantic explosion about 5 miles up in space, about 1 minute and 15 seconds after the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger today. It was witnessed by the parents, the husband and the children of Krista McAuliffe, who is the school teacher, of course, riding along today, and apparently she has been lost. Also, members of her third grade class were there with a banner that read, "Go, Krista, go." In Concord, New Hampshire, the high school had been assembled in an auditorium, 1,500 altogether, to watch on television this launch. And across the country, for that matter, young people have been watching what happened today, and it's bound to have a traumatic effect on youngsters as well as those of us who are grown-ups and think that we are used to the unexpected in life and find out that we are not. To help us deal with all that now is Dr. Ravenscroft, Ken Ravenscroft, who is from Georgetown University. He's a child psychiatrist. Dr. Ravenscroft, as the parent of youngsters, what would I say to them tonight as we discuss this around the dinner table?
Well, I think one of the major things actually is to find out, first of all, to let them know you're aware of what's happened, and then to find out from them what they've been through so far that day. Obviously, parents have to react. They're stunned, they're in grieving, they are having whatever range of reactions they're having. And I think it's healthy and natural to show that and to communicate it. Some care perhaps not to overwhelm, and to keep some reserve and attune.
National Aeronautics and Space Administration, obviously if they would release these pictures, they were aware of the situation. But it is of some concern, could possibly the icing that happened during the night, even though it was gone by the time of the launch, could it have had some effect to that main fuel tank? That is going to be one of the concerns, because obviously something went wrong with the main fuel tank at the time of the explosion. Whether it started to break up, split apart, or whether there was a leak in it is extremely unclear, obviously, at this particular point. But one can imagine that not only looking at the videotapes of the actual explosion, but now they're going over, once again, the state of the shuttle itself in those hours previous to the liftoff. This has been a plagued mission from, it was originally destined to lift off last Friday, but it was delayed a couple of days until Sunday, and then there was the situation where they forecast bad weather for Sunday, but it turned out the weather was fine, but they canceled the mission based on the potential of bad weather. And then yesterday, when they were hoping to launch the shuttle, there was the concern once again over the weather, high winds, and then concern over a door latch that they had problems with. Today, though, the indications were that everything was A-OK. The launch took place, but as we know now, tragically, it only lasted for a very short period of time. Perhaps at this point, now 2.5 hours after the Shuttle Challenger lifted off and exploded just off Cape Kennedy, it's time now to once again look at those pictures. As tragic and as awful as they are, they're the only major evidence that anyone has to go on to try and figure out what could have possibly gone wrong with the Shuttle Challenger. This is the liftoff just seconds before the explosion. The last words to the shuttle, all throttles go, the response A-OK, and then this is what happened. Now that is the normal speed of the pictures as they took place at 11:39 Eastern Time this morning. But what everyone is looking at now, not just the media, not just reporters, but the analysts at the Cape Kennedy situation themselves, are trying to determine by looking at slow motion pictures. We'll take this slowly, almost frame by frame. You can start to see, now if we stop it there for a minute, let me try to explain what you're looking at. Obviously a very fuzzy and focused picture, but clearly the main projectile with the flame shooting out the back of it is the main fuel tank. That is a normal situation pretty well at that particular point with all that flame shooting out of the back of it. Just below it is the shuttle. It's upside down. You see the tail section pointing downwards to the bottom of your picture, and the main body of the shuttle attached to that major fuel tank. What is not quite in view are two solid white booster rockets. Now at this point, there's starting to be a problem with flame. It's starting to be seen in an area where it shouldn't. Stop it there, and you start to see it on the top of the main fuel tank, circled there. That's where the flame starts to spread, and it spreads very rapidly. When you're looking at this frame by frame, you're seeing a picture go by very slowly. This all happened in a matter of milliseconds. But that flame, as you watch, we advance the pictures, will start to creep right over underneath the major fuel tank and ignite just at the site, at the bottom edge of the shuttle itself. Now, this all happened in the milliseconds before the explosion. As we continue to advance the picture, you will see how rapidly the explosion takes place, engulfs that whole area, the major fuel tank, the shuttle itself.
McNair, also a mission specialist, PhD, 35 years old, born in Lake City, South Carolina. Ellison Onizuka, Major, United States Air Force, 39 years old, born in Hawaii, also a mission specialist. These were all the astronauts. 41-year-old Gregory Jarvis, the payload specialist, the man in charge of the cargo aboard the Space Shuttle. 41 years old, born in Detroit. And 37-year-old Krista McAuliffe, school teacher, mother of two, from Concord, New Hampshire. While astronaut Judy Resnick was preparing for the flight, Judith Resnick, one of two women aboard the flight today, the school teacher, Krista McAuliffe was one, Judy Resnick was the other woman. While Judith Resnick was preparing for the flight, she talked about what it meant to be the second female astronaut. Sally Ride had been the first.
Is there anything that needs to be said about the second woman in space? The U.S. woman?
I'm very comfortable flying with this crew. We have gotten along very well from the beginning. We work well together. We have a good time in training. I'm very comfortable with the whole mission in general, and I view myself as part of the team. There's 6 of us, and I have about 1/6 of the responsibility, and the other guys have about 1/6, and that's the way we intend to do it on orbit, and we're all very comfortable with that, and I'm very confident of their abilities, and I think they're very confident of my abilities in the areas that I have responsibilities, and I trust them in the areas that I don't know that much about to go do the right thing, and we have that mutual trust among us, and I think that will make for a good mission because we have a good crew.
What does Judith think about going to space?
Well, I'm eager to go.
A long time waiting.
I've been here for 6 years. I think it's about time, the right length of time to be at NASA and working in the system before you go fly. There are a lot of people who have waited longer for flights. There are some who have waited less time for flights. I'm very satisfied with where I am right now. I'm ready to go fly this mission with the rest of the crew, and I hope after the mission's over that NASA wants me to fly another one.
Judith Resnick, before the flight, which was delayed 2 hours today as NASA checked for icicles on and around the spacecraft. 28 degrees in that part of Florida this morning, unusually cold there, and they delayed the flight for a couple of hours to check for icicles. That interview done with Judy Resnick as she awaited the flight, not today, but at another time, as she was waiting to become the second woman, a second American woman in space. Mark well that she said she'd been waiting 6 years. She'd been preparing 6 years for this flight into space. And we're told there's many as 2.5 million students in the United States and Canada may have been watching the live television coverage today in what was called the Classroom Earth Project. They were watching when the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded. The project was designed to relay teacher Krista McAuliffe's lessons back to pupils. And there's no doubt in my mind that the teachers involved in that project before and perhaps just after today's terrible event were reminding students, as we can all remind ourselves, how much dedication goes into being an astronaut, how long it takes to prepare. It's homework, homework, homework. It's grueling, it's taxing, and it takes this...
Electrical engineering. This was her second shuttle mission. She had logged 144 hours, 57 minutes in space. Ronald McNair, age 36, also a mission specialist, was selected as an astronaut in 1979. He, too, was a veteran of the shuttle, making his first shuttle flight in 1984, bringing his background in physics and laser technology to the program. The third mission specialist on today's launch was Air Force Colonel Ellison Onizuka, age 39, born in Hawaii. A former aerospace engineer and pilot, he had taught at the elite Air Force Test Pilot School in California. He became a NASA astronaut in 1979. Onizuka was on his second shuttle mission. His initial flight in 1984 was the first dedicated to the Department of Defense. He was married with 2 children. Gregory Jarvis, a payload specialist, age 41, was a Hughes aircraft engineer on board to conduct tests on the effects of weightlessness on fluids carried in tanks. Born in Detroit, trained as an Air Force satellite engineer, this was Jarvis's first shuttle mission. He is survived by his wife. And finally, Krista McAuliffe, age 37, the social studies teacher from New Hampshire, the first private citizen selected to fly aboard the shuttle. She'd been chosen from more than 11,000 applicants nationwide. She's survived by her husband, 2 children, and the students in Concord, New Hampshire.
ABC Stone Phillips, I'm sorry it took us a while to get to that, to bring you the human dimension of the other people in the crew, and the reason I think for that is because Krista McAuliffe was the first civilian in space, the first teacher, and as is our and the nation's tendency, you tend to focus, I think, on the first. But there is some indication of the human side of the other 6 members of the crew who all appear to have lost their lives over the Atlantic Ocean this morning. Just to pick up on a couple of pieces of information, the Space Agency now says it is going to have at least a statement at 3:30 this afternoon Eastern Time. The indication so far that we're getting, certainly from the White House and from Cape Canaveral and from Houston, is that they do not know a great deal yet, but by 3:30 this afternoon Eastern Time they will have something to say. Larry Speaks in his briefing to White House reporters announcing that the State of the Union was going to be officially postponed for a week also alluded to the fact that the President might want to talk to the nation this evening about this human tragedy and this clear setback to America's adventures in space. And even while he said that one of the great ways to honor these people would be to go ahead with the space program, the President may indeed want to share his thoughts with the nation this evening in a more personal way than via Mr. Speaks. And if he does, we shall, of course, be here to bring them to you. ABC's Lynn Scher, who covers space on a regular basis for us, is standing by in California. Lynn, I know you've been trying to talk to some other people who are involved in the program. Have you come up with anything?
Well, yes, I'm afraid I don't have the answers that we really want, which are what happened. But I have talked to some of the astronauts at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. The mood there, as you can well expect, is very glum. All of the astronauts who travel frequently around this country and abroad, of course, have been recalled to Houston to help deal with the situation, to deal with the crisis. And one of the things, unfortunately, that they have to start doing is deal, of course, with the families and the effects of their colleagues. I wanted to point out also that when something like this happens, it really affects the entire space community. There is no one, for all the petty jealousies that go on, for all the competition, there is no one who will be gloating about this accident, specifically the Soviets. I obviously do not know this firsthand, but judging by what's happened in the past, there have been 4 Soviet cosmonauts, of course, who were killed. American astronauts have felt extremely sympathetic. They are all colleagues in space. And I would bet that that exact emotion is going on in the Soviet Union right now.
Lynn, it's very interesting that one of the very first messages of condolence we had this morning of a public way was, in fact, from the Soviet embassy. So as you do is you share this interest and fascination in space.
Well, it's true. I mean, after all, they lost 4 cosmonauts in space before we lost any. We have lost astronauts on the ground, but there's that feeling among all of them that they're all doing the same thing despite the political problems and the political competition. So there's a grand sense of loss and despair among the entire space community. And one other thing, when Senator Glenn was speaking, I noticed his very moving thoughts. This is a man very graciously did not say something. When the spaceflight participant program began.
And when we switch from this tail shot to the side shot, you see those little flame leaks? And if you could go very slow motion through that area, you can see these flame leaks, and then you can see one of them impact right on the vehicle. There you can see the little flame leaks just forward of the nozzle.
Let's try to stop it right there if we can. When you talk about flame leaks in the middle left-hand center of your screen.
Right, now these appear to be coming out of the left SRB just forward of the nozzle area, but it's hard to tell. You know, they could be coming from the tank too. But
excuse me, Leo, but by SRB you mean solid rocket booster is SRB.
That's right.
You think they appear to be coming out of there?
It appears to be that it's coming out of the area of the left SRB nozzle, just forward of the nozzle.
Now that's the solid rocket booster, not the liquid fuel tank.
No, the liquid fuel tank I don't think would have flame leaks of that nature, but it's hard to tell. NASA, when they get their data, might be able to determine this. But once this explosion occurs, then you later see what appears to be the right SRB coming out of this cloud, and it's still fairly intact. But once the explosion occurred, the whole vehicle became probably separated, and I don't think it's significant to say that the one SRB came off ahead of the other one.
Leo Krupp, the Right,
there you can see the SRB coming out.
Right, just to the upper right-hand quarter of the screen.
Yes. Now, I assume that's the right SRB, but I can't be certain because...
Leo Krupp, you've worked with us before on our little models, and if you can watch your monitor there, I think it's, insofar as we can, we want people to understand exactly what happened. NASA will at some point, we hope soon, but as soon as they know, tell us why it happened. Now, Leo Krupp, the former Rockwell shuttle research pilot, has gone through talking about the SRBs. These are the solid rocket boosters on the side of the space shuttle. This is the liquid tank on which the space shuttle rides. Now, what we saw falling away after the explosion, Leo Krupp, check me as we go along here, was a large piece of the right-hand side solid rocket booster.
It appeared to be the entire SRB, the entire solid rocket booster, and I assume it was the right one because it looked like the left one was the one that exploded.
All right, so it looked to you, and I just want to check and watch me to go here, that it was the left solid rocket booster. At either that solid rocket booster or perhaps this area between the two where you saw what you described as possible, what did you call them, fuel leaks?
Flame leaks. It looks like a burn through, but it was well aft on that thing down near the nozzle of the.
All right, down in this area, was it?
Yes, way down near the bottom, right just forward of the nozzle.
Now let me make sure I understand, Leo Krupp, that from looking at the slow motion of the videotape, that it looks to you as there might be what we call a flame leak down in this area of the left-hand solid rocket booster.
Yes.
Now, then of course, once there is an explosion, the highly volatile liquid hydrogen in the larger tank, I don't want to say comes into play, but once you saw the huge fireball, clearly that was also involved.
Yes.
Leo Krupp, what indications would the astronauts get that something was wrong, and what could they do about it?
Well, things happened so rapidly that they probably didn't have any indication. If they did have an indication, say the vehicle was deviating from its trajectory, the range safety officer would alert him by turning on a range safety light in the cockpit, and this then gives the crew a few seconds to do a fast separation from the external tank and the solid rocket boosters. By just throwing one switch and punching a button, they can separate the shuttle from this power package of the tank and the two solid rocket boosters. However, it doesn't appear that happened.
It would have to happen so quickly. The commander and the pilot would have to make that decision almost instantly, would they not?
Well, once the range safety light comes on, this tells the crew that the range safety officer is going to detonate the vehicle, so the crew has to do the fast SEP immediately. They only have a matter of a couple seconds to get off the vehicle.
Leo Krupp, you helped design some of these space vehicles. I want to make sure I understand that inside that cockpit, the commander and the pilot are watching an incredible amount of electrical, mechanical, and computerized equipment. When something goes wrong, a red light comes on. They could have seen the red light, and they have the ability to separate the space shuttle itself from that explosive fuel tank on which it's riding and the two solid rocket boosters, what you call the SRBs.
That's right. This can be done manually by throwing one switch and pressing one button, and usually the pilot riding in the right seat is standing by to do this if the need arises.
But important, sorry, go ahead.
Before he would do a fast SEP, however, he would probably be alerted by the range safety officer, and to my knowledge, this problem occurred so rapidly that the range safety officer wasn't involved in the decision-making of whether the vehicle was going to be able to maintain trajectory or not.
Forgive me for the interruption. It was unintended, but I was going to note that Mission Control in Houston seemed to have no indication that anything was wrong before the explosion.
That's right. If you listen to that last tape and the voice there, everything appeared to be perfectly normal, and then suddenly these small flame leaks occurred, and a matter of a second later, the vehicle detonated.
Question, Leo Krupp. We're talking...
The payload specialists are the people who work with the experiments, of course. "41 years old. And Krista McAuliffe, the school teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, chosen in nationwide competition. Her husband and two children watching today along with her parents. She was 37 years old. Krista McAuliffe was to conduct classrooms in space was part of a program announced by President Reagan during the 1984 presidential campaign. Ronald McNair, 35 years old, one of the few black astronauts, was also on board today. He was a laser physics expert. He enjoyed what he called the fantasy of space. And this is Ellison Onizuka. Ellison Onizuka was the first Japanese-American in space. He was on board, an Air Force major. He was a flight test engineer who took part in America's first manned military space flight. Judy Resnick, who'd made an earlier flight. She helped pave the way for sexual equality for women in space. She was looking for a way to broaden her career as an electronics expert when she left her native Akron, Ohio, looking for the adventure of space. Enthusiastic. And this is Michael Smith, the 40-year-old shuttle co-pilot, a crack naval aviator and test pilot. They like nothing better than an afternoon of quiet woodworking or a quick game of squash. He had flown 28 different types of civilian and military aircraft, logging more than 4,200 hours of flying time, including 3,900 hours in jet aircraft. The can-do crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger, now apparently lost in a tremendous fireball explosion out over the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Florida. Rescue crews continue to screen the area looking for whatever debris they can recover, any signs of life. So far, no word of any survivors. John Palmer's in New York. John?
Yes, Tom, some stations along the line may be leaving the network to do local programming, but we will, however, continue network coverage of this tragic event. We'd like to show you now two launches, the tragic launch today of the Space Shuttle Challenger and the launch back on January 12th of the Space Shuttle Columbia. That was the one that was delayed for some 7 days, you'll recall. Here they are now, side by side, today's launch and the launch on January 12th of the Columbia. Some observers felt that today's launch was a little bit slower in getting off the pad. There's no real indication that the computers show that to be true. But at this point, everything appears to be going well. Both launches look pretty much the same, mirror launches. But as this flight of the Challenger on your left, as it moves to 1 minute and about 15 seconds into the flight, there is the tragic explosion, the ball of fire, and then you see the pieces falling to Earth. It was almost an hour, we think that time is about correct, before they could get the ships in the area, the Coast Guard cutters, 3 of them, and a frigate and a hydrofoil launched along with paramedics and helicopters to that area because so much debris was falling down. Now we're getting very close to the point of the explosion. Again, obviously, it was a fuel explosion. How it happened, nobody knows. And then there is that painful mention made by Dan Molina from one of the experts who helped design the shuttle that we may never know what happened. That, of course, would be very bad indeed as we go forward, and if we go forward in the Space Shuttle program as we are doing now. Now the close-up on your left, there is the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger this morning, about 11:39 Eastern Time, and those 2 prongs moving out. One of them we can certainly identify as one of the solid rocket boosters, perhaps the other is, and then you see all types of debris raining down in what, Tom, you described a little earlier as kind of a strange beauty there, a blue sky. The launch took off this morning. The weather was very clear, a delay for just a couple of hours there because of the weather conditions. To recap, it's been mentioned that the President has delayed or canceled his State of the Union address for tonight. He's moved it for 1 week. The House will meet in session, and they will, of course, pay tribute to the astronauts. Vice President Bush is now heading down toward the Cape. He is going with the acting administrator, Donald Graham, and also we expect to find a little bit more about, hopefully a lot more about what happened coming up in a little less than an hour now at 3:30 Eastern Time when NASA holds a news conference at the Kennedy Space Center at the Cape. Now back to Washington and Tom.
Thanks, John Palmer. We've just been handed a press release by something called Caroon and Black in Space, Inc. That's a leading United States and international satellite and space insurance brokerage firm. It announced today, earlier, that it had donated a personal accident insurance policy to Sharon Krista McAuliffe, the high school teacher who will be the first private citizen to fly aboard the shuttle. The policy provides $1 million of coverage and includes all of McAuliffe's activities while she is riding as a passenger aboard the Orbiter Challenger on this mission. That was donated before the launch of today's flight, the launch that was tragically witnessed by Krista McAuliffe's husband, her 2 children, and her parents. Steve Delaney is at the Kennedy Space Center, Cape Canaveral, Florida, where George Bush and the acting administrator of NASA will be headed under President Reagan's directions. Steve? Apparently we're having some audio difficulties, of course, with Steve Delaney, who's at the Cape. We want to just bring you up to date on what is likely to happen. We're going to have continuing coverage here on NBC News until this story is resolved in one form or another, and then we'll continue our coverage even after that. President Reagan has scheduled a special address to the nation tonight from the Oval Office directly. There has been a postponement of the State of the Union speech, which was scheduled before a joint session of Congress at 9 o'clock tonight, now postponed for 1 full week, as the enormity of this tragedy begins to unfold, really, for all of us, individually and collectively. The tragedy begins to really deepen and have the effect that any kind of tragedy of this sort has on all of us, because we're bound together in so many ways by the space program, and in a way I suppose that all of us were riding with Krista McAuliffe today. And now let's go back to the Kennedy Space Center and Steve Delaney. Steve?
Yes, Tom. When Vice President Bush was first elected, was first in office early in 1981, I came down here with him to watch him go through a guided tour of the Columbia Space Shuttle, which was the first one to fly, had not yet flown, and he was met by
in shock this morning. We were over at the White House this morning, a number of reporters being briefed from the White House point of view on the President's State of the Union message this evening, which has now been canceled. The President was handed a note, as were the rest of us. He stood in shocked silence to learn what many people in the nation who had been watching it had already learned, that 7 people appear to have died on board Challenger about 2.5 minutes, or a little more than 2 minutes after it left Cape Canaveral in a bright blue sky. Since then, if there has been an overall tendency, at least here in the nation's capital, among officials, it has been to express enormous sadness and great shock, but also dedication to the program. We heard from Senator Jake Garn, who was one of the 2 politicians to fly in space. Congressman Bill Nelson is the other. We haven't heard from him in person this morning. But one of the ways to honor the people is to go ahead with the space program. We heard the same from Senator John Glenn. We've heard from so many people what I think many of our own reactions have been, that we'd all become so accustomed to the safety and the routineness with which the Space Shuttle Challenger and the other 3 presently active space shuttles go into space, that this is an enormous double setback. Challenger is one of 4, as we said. There was Columbia, there is Discovery, and there is Atlantis. The first test vehicle, as some of you may recall, was named Enterprise, but it was used just as a test vehicle and did not carry people into space. And they were now on a rotation, 15 flights planned for this year, as the Space Shuttle, the world's first reusable spacecraft, goes into something of a, I think I've heard people call it as a bus service, carrying experiments and individuals doing experiments into space on a very regular basis. This to have been an extremely active year with 15 flights. As the President...
Sorrow. The gentleman from California.
The Speaker of the House, Congressman Tip O'Neill, commenting on the resolution which was passed in the House of Representatives earlier today, resolving that the House should express its condolences to the families of the crew members on board Challenger, and resolve, which I misled you slightly, adjourn for the day as a mark of respect. I should have had the sense to tell you that everybody would want to talk to that resolution before the House finally did adjourn, but it will adjourn. And the President's State of the Union message, which he was going to give at 9 o'clock Eastern time this evening to a joint session of the House and the Senate, will now not be held for at least a week. Talk about contrasts, I suppose, in a way. At a time of a mission, NASA bombards us with information. All of the telemetry, virtually every move, and you've seen us cover it for years now. Every time we have an opportunity for a television picture from the Cape or from Houston or from space, for the last almost 4 hours now, this is all that we have seen from Cape Canaveral. Just one photograph on what they call their video release system, telling us that there will be a news conference this afternoon at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, at which time we hope, but we should not be wishfully hopeful, I think, at this point, to give us some more information on what happened today. Vice President Bush, as you know, has been sent by President Reagan, I'm sure without any effort whatsoever, to go to Cape Canaveral, where he is going to talk to and console on behalf of the President, and therefore on behalf of the official family of the first family of the nation, accompanied by John Glenn, who you just saw, and Senator Jake Garn from Utah, who just walked across in front of your picture. And though I don't recognize him by sight, that may be Congressman Bill Nelson from Florida as well. We're going to go with the Vice President to console the family members in Florida. Sam Donaldson is standing by at the White House. Sam, does the Vice President have any other particular brief with him?
Well, the Vice President, of course, is going to head the first look from the White House's standpoint at what went wrong today. He's not leading an investigation, as we heard Larry Speake say, but he is going to take a look at the first amount of information that NASA has and report back to the President.
Sam, the President has put off his State of the Union, as we've said a number of times now. Do you know when it's going to happen, A? And B, is he going to talk to the nation tonight?
Well, it's going to happen a week from today. That's what Press Secretary Speake said. He is going to speak from the Oval Office for about 5 minutes, sometime a little later today, but it's not scheduled as a prime-time speech, Peter. As soon as NASA holds its news conference, about 3:30 Eastern Time, the White House is going to gear up, and perhaps in the next hour or two after that, the President will deliver a very short 5-minute speech.
But the President, the Vice President, Sam, is clearly going to the Cape as a mark of respect rather than as a member of an investigating team, right?
Well, that's his first thing. Maybe I misunderstood you when you said, does he have any other brief or a brief? I thought perhaps you meant, does he have any other duties when he went down there?
No, and if you misunderstood me, it's probably at this point, Sam, because I misspoke. Any changes at the White House now in the last few hours?
No, I think now everything is in a routine after they've made this decision to cancel the State of the Union. As you know, first, Peter, the President was inclined to go ahead. In fact, in talking to reporters, I said to him, but it will cast a pall over your speech tonight, which is going to be an upbeat speech if you deliver it. He said, yes, that's true, but you can't stop governing the nation. But after he went back to the Oval Office, I'm told that almost everyone, including the President, thought about it a little bit and unanimously decided they couldn't go ahead with this speech. That to do so would be misunderstood completely and would be totally out of place.
Sam, does the President have any passionate personal interest in space, such as, for example, John Kennedy had?
No, there's no evidence that Mr. Reagan has any interest such as that in space. He's followed it as most laymen have, and of course as president he's had to pass on appropriations and things like that, but he doesn't refer to it often. He has not pushed it in speeches throughout the years. It is clearly not one of his top priorities.
I heard one reporter at a White House briefing we heard earlier with our speaks asking whether or not this was going to have any effect on the Strategic Defense Initiative or Star Wars.
Huddled around TV sets and expressed the same shock being felt throughout the United States.
Terrible.
What do you think it'll do for America's space program?
Oh, I personally don't think that it will change very much.
It's very, very horrible, but I think they must do it again.
The Germans feel a special understanding of this loss because late last year they were part of another shuttle launch in a joint venture with the United States. Chancellor Helmut Kohl and Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres were holding a news conference in Bonn when they were informed of the incident. Armed Services Television broke in with live reports from the United States so that the 200,000 soldiers stationed here can follow the story. And throughout Europe, millions...
And all the excitement was dead, extinguished in a flash. Maximum heart rate.
torn up inside. This is the emotional part. And immediately the reporter begins to ask, what the hell went wrong?
And in the small towns that surround the Space Center, America's tragedy was their personal tragedy.
I saw it, I watched it, I cried. I couldn't believe it.
I came outside and I said, there it goes. And I watched it go up, and then suddenly, boom.
It's a great loss. The life, the knowledge, surely.
There were 7 victims who died today, and millions of others who still live.
Velocity 2,900 feet per second.
I'm sad. I've cried, and I will cry again. I really will. I'm sorry.
Bernard Goldberg, CBS News, Cocoa Beach, Florida.
Now, using our scale model of the Shuttle Challenger and slow-motion, stop-action videotape of the accident in space, let's try to go over once again just what happened. First to the model. You can see that the Challenger on either side has the solid rocket boosters, the tanks that hold the rubber-like solid fuel. The large orange tank is the main liquid fuel tank. Now, we'll rotate the model just a bit to roughly the position the Challenger was in just before the explosion. What we're seeing now is stop-action footage of the mission, just about 1 minute and 11 seconds in. We see the shuttle and one of the solid rocket boosters. At this point, a small flame leak is already visible in between. As we roll this ahead in slow motion, another flame leak appears above about 1 second later. Then, scant tenths of a second later, a large clear flame, and then the last massive explosion. The Challenger enveloped in a terrible fireball over the next 3 seconds. Finally, just past 1 minute and 14 seconds, you can see one of the solid rocket boosters blown aside in the top right-hand corner of the screen, the booster shooting off away from the fireball. The 7 crew members aboard Space Shuttle Challenger today were Spacecraft Commander Francis R. Dick Scobie, 46, born in Washington State. He flew combat in Vietnam. The pilot today was 40-year-old Michael Mike Smith, born in Beaufort, North Carolina, a naval aviator and test pilot who'd flown 28 different kinds of aircraft. Judith Resnick, 36, hometown Akron, Ohio, an electrical engineer who earlier became this nation's 2nd woman in space. 35-year-old Ronald McNair. He held a doctorate from MIT. He was a scholar from Lake City, South Carolina. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Ellison Onizuka, who was from Hawaii. He was 39 and last year took part in America's first manned military space flight. 41-year-old Gregory Jarvis, a native of Detroit. He was bumped from Columbia's December flight to today's Challenger flight to make room for Congressman Bill Nelson as a congressional observer. And the 7th member of this crew was Krista Corrigan McAuliffe, the 37-year-old school teacher and mother of 2 from Concord, New Hampshire. What started as a party at Concord High School today ended in tears as students watching the launch learned about as hard a lesson as life offers. Steve Young was in Concord.
4, 3, 2, 1. About 300 Concord High School students had gathered to watch the launch of their star social studies teacher. It took a minute to realize that what they were watching was a disaster.
Like to hear about it or not?
Students were dismissed about an hour later, still no.
Everybody's just like, they're all just falling apart, all the teachers and everything.
I don't ever want to go there. It's been proven unsafe.
Afterward, the principal said guidance counselors will try to help students anguished by the tragedy.
They're telling kids in particular that it's okay to feel bad about this. It's okay to be sorrowful. It's okay to cry.
McAuliffe was one of the most popular teachers at Concord High. Students followed her training every step of the way. The 37-year-old mother of 2 hoped to show by her example that space is a world open to anyone.
One of the things that I hope to bring back into the classroom is to make that connection with the students that they too are part of history, that the space program belongs to them.
We were with them on Saturday night, and her little girl said to me, "Is Mommy in space yet?" And I said, "No, not yet, pretty soon." And everybody was just so happy. Everybody was so thrilled that out of 11,000 teachers, Krista was the one that was selected.
There were mostly empty streets in Concord today and deserted shops as the town began to move.
I just watched it over again. It happened again.
very sad for the family and everybody.
One friend took a picture of Krista during a town celebration last summer. She picked it up just today, left with the photo and her grief. Steve Young, CBS News, Concord.
Besides the symbolism of putting school teacher Krista McAuliffe aboard today's flight, to be the first public citizen American civilian in space, to spread the wonder and to inspire and teach the young back on Earth on live television, this Challenger mission had other goals in keeping with its reusable space plane, space truck workhorse role. It was supposed to put up a $100 million satellite that would have become part of NASA's own shuttle communications network. It was also supposed to launch a $10 million payload to study Halley's Comet. Coming up next, Leslie Stahl has the latest on President Reagan's postponement of his State of the Union address, and Bob Simon will look at our space voyaging nation in a state of shock.
Ever try borrowing for something unusual, like a family gym? Big financial institutions don't always understand, but someone does. Hi, I'm Jack. The boss at Beneficial. We're big, but we have Beneficial home equity loans just right for home improvements. It's just you and the boss, and a commitment, usually in 48 hours.
That does it.
Glad it worked out. Beneficial. Talk to the manager, and you're talking to the boss.
Io ho un segreto di bellezza di grande valore che rende la mia pelle meravigliosamente vellutata e più giovanile.
It's the one secret 50 million women share, oil of Olay. So sheer it quickly penetrates, replenishing youthful fluids for a softer, younger look. Every day, women around the world believe in oil of Olay.
Riuscirà anche a mantenerti più giovane.
Also available in a new luxurious cream.
President Reagan first said that he was going to go ahead with tonight's scheduled State of the Union speech, then decided to put it off when the full dimension of the tragedy sank in. White House correspondent Leslie Stahl reports.
At the White House, the president watched a replay of the tragedy this morning in stunned silence. He said it was a horrible thing, a tremendous shock.
Today is a day for mourning and remembering. Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country.
The president postponed his upbeat State of the Union speech tonight for 1 week and sent Vice President Bush off to Cape Canaveral this afternoon to convey his feelings personally to the families. But despite his sorrow, the president said he's determined that the space program continue.
We don't hide our space program. We don't keep secrets and cover things up. We do it all up front and in public. That's the way freedom is, and we wouldn't change it for a minute. We'll continue our quest in space. There will be more shuttle flights and more shuttle crews, and yes, more volunteers, more civilians, more teachers in space. Nothing ends here.
It was Mr. Reagan's idea to send a teacher into space. Krista McAuliffe was his first thought when he heard the news this morning. The president called the entire crew courageous pioneers who gave their lives on the new frontier.
We'll never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God.
Space Agency officials waited most of the day before saying anything, and when they did speak, it was only to say they won't say anything until and unless they know for sure what happened, what went wrong. David Martin reports the investigation, day one.
NASA doesn't know what happened, and neither do the makers of these white solid rocket boosters, which helped lift the shuttle from the launch pad.
I don't believe there's sufficient evidence on the replays to be able to ascertain the nature of the problem.
Or the makers of the orange external fuel tank, which carried 500,000 pounds of highly volatile liquid hydrogen and oxygen.
What we have is what you see on television, and it's very hard to tell anything from that.
While investigators search for answers, there is only speculation by informed observers about the apparent leak which touched off the giant fireball, dwarfing the remains of one of the 140-foot solid rocket boosters.
It appears that there were some burn-throughs and some flame leaks coming out, and once this extremely hot gas comes out, it could ignite an explosion of the external tank.
But another expert said that alone could not have caused the massive fireball.
The very large explosion that took place would have to have involved the propellants in this large tank.
The hydrogen and oxygen.
Hydrogen and oxygen in that tank.
What could have caused the external tank to fail like that? Could it have been unexpected weather conditions high in the atmosphere?
Winds aloft looked good. We didn't have any exceedances as far as our load indicators are concerned, to my knowledge, and we thought everything was in good shape for a launch this morning.
Could it have been the ice which coated the shuttle just hours before launch? Most observers say no, since the launch was delayed to allow the ice time to melt. Right now, there are many more questions than answers. Until the investigators can come up with both answers and solutions, no more Americans will venture into space. David Martin, CBS News, the Pentagon.
In a moment, the U.S. space program under pressure. Was it too much pressure?